You're watching Beyond Market. Welcome. I'm Esther Awuni. Many thanks for joining us. On today's show, we ask the question, how can Nigeria and the U.S. forge a deeper partnership? As always, you can join the conversation with the hashtag Beyond Market. You can also send your thoughts, your comments to my Twitter handle. It's at Esther O. Awuni. Now, with the West African Trade Hub on the way, the U.S. government says it's willing to support a partnership between the U.S. investors and Africa. Brent Omdahl, commercial counselor at the U.S. Department of Commerce, joins me to discuss the United States' plans to forge deeper ties with Nigeria. Thank you, Brent. It's a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Thank you, Esther. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good to have you back again. Well, we spoke 2 months ago.
Yeah.
It's the maiden edition of the USA Fair. Perhaps let's start there. You did bring some American companies to come see some of the opportunities here. Bring us up to speed. What's happened after that?
Sure, yeah. Great question. We had 33 American companies, most of them new to market, come join us for the 3-day exhibition and fair, where we really tried the best that we could to connect those companies with vetted, great Nigerian companies. Already we've seen some deals come as a result. A couple of them have signed distributors agreements, including one in the ag space, a soil enhancement company, one in the fast-moving consumer goods space, and then some other kind of deeper engagements are taking place. One of the companies that came and participated with us was a financing company called Energy Funds, and they're looking at some medium-sized infrastructure projects that it looks like they'll be able to wrap some financing around. So we're really excited about those outcomes. There are many more to come, though, too. And let me just say, we had really hoped to create a tradition by launching USA Fair 2019. And with the feedback that we've gotten from the marketplace, the feedback that we've gotten from our Nigerian partners, and also from the ambassador, it will be a feature of our strategy, our commercial strategy, and embassy strategy going forward.
You see this happening every year?
Yeah, so next year I would expect 50 to 60 companies, so we would get close to probably doubling the size.
That is interesting. But what is the story? What is the central theme of what these companies are saying about what they've learned about the Nigerian business environment or the Nigerian companies that they've either spoken to or gone into partnership with?
Right. So I always say when I'm talking about American companies doing business in Africa that the interest is very high, but the knowledge base is low. We have a couple of levers to help us mitigate that. One of them is Nigerian Americans coming back and either investing or doing business. One of the cool features of USA Fair 2019 is that we had 4 Nigerian American companies participating with us, a couple of them in the ICT space. What's great is that those are fast-moving industries. They're industries where the barriers to entry are pretty low, and so the impact can be great. We're looking to leverage more of that moving forward, both in the ICT space, agriculture, and energy infrastructure.
Now, also, the last time we spoke, you talked about the fact that the U.S. Export-Import Bank now had a full board, and that would give you more space, as it were, to play to unlock some of those projects that had been stalled across the African continent.
Right.
Has there been any progress?
Yeah, so there has been. I may have mentioned before that the XM portfolio was, I don't know, $10 billion on the continent. A large portion of that was in Nigeria. Exim Bank has always been very interested in Nigeria and has had a very full portfolio. In the recent years, because they haven't had a full board, they haven't been able to do deals over $10 million. Okay. So Exim is there to provide guarantees on purchases of American products, right? So they'll finance up to 85% of the purchase of an American product or service that will go into an infrastructure project or for the outright purchase. Because of that $10 million cap, it's been difficult to do the larger kind of transformational infrastructure projects. But we've seen interest now from a couple of corners, both in the healthcare space and in the ICT space, the broadband space, that we're very excited about. And we're pretty sure they'll go forward.
I was just going to ask, if you could expand more on that in terms of perhaps a timeline, if there have been meetings happening.
Yeah.
What we can
Okay.
expect
So
something
let me give
solid.
you an example. So, and perhaps we can talk about Prosper Africa a little bit later, because that is kind of our whole of government approach to deepen our commercial engagement on the continent. What that looks like on the ground here are many activities that we've been doing, but in a better coordinated way now. So, year and a half ago, 2 years ago, Nigeria put out tenders for broadband expansion in the country. And they were based on the 6 geopolitical zones here. And so we were watching very carefully who was bidding on those deals.
Okay.
We sat down together with one of our partner agencies, the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, and said, what can we do to generate interest in American products, American solutions to grow broadband here? And so they organized, USTDA organized a reverse trade mission to look at our broadband sector in the U.S. They looked at technology providers like Corning that make really all of the technology that goes into fiber optics. They looked at how we regulate the industry so as to stimulate competition, how to maximize revenue to the states and to the federal government. And so we had both private sector players, those who had been bidding on all of these expansion projects, in addition to government decision makers on the reverse trade mission. Our intent was really to open up opportunities for American companies in a meaningful, transformative kind of project. I'm happy to say that one of those companies, based in Abuja, has really started to partner looking at the American solutions. Actually, a couple of them have, but one of them in particular is in discussions with XM right now to see what kind of financing solutions exist for the purchase of American fiber optic technology, which is the best in the world, sets the standard. So we're excited about that. That's how the process works when the U.S. government is kind of running on all 4 cylinders at one time.
But what is the big picture for the Prosper Africa?
Yeah, okay, so Prosper Africa is really kind of a new way of thinking, a new paradigm that our government has put forward, really driven by the interests of the private sector, right? So for too long, the relationship between the United States and Africa has been defined by its aid. And really the solutions to economic growth lie within the private sector. So we were looking for ways to really unleash the power of the private sector. We can break it down to 3 separate components. The first is kind of internal to the U.S. government, organizing ourselves to better support U.S. company efforts to deepen their engagement on the continent. What I mean by that is opening up a one-stop shop where companies can get support on an advocacy level, where they can come together and get financing from the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which is also expanding, which we can talk about in a moment, through XM Bank, where they then also can find the right business partners. And I should mention pulling in private sector financing too, because the government is not the full solution. The government, from a financing perspective, can help mitigate risk and maybe do some things that private sector financiers need a little urging to do or a little risk mitigation to do.
Like a government guarantee.
Government guarantee could be one, or picking up some private equity in a position to signal that this is something that the government is going to play in and will foster. And really, with the expansion of OPIC, one of the goals and objectives is to make more equity investments in private sector deals here, particularly on the infrastructure side.
Now, for the Prosper Africa, how is it different or similar to the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA?
Okay, yeah, so very good. I would say that AGOA, as a strategic objective, would be an important component of Prosper Africa. So I talked about the first aspect, and that's what we're doing internally as a government. The second would be facilitating transactions, and I touched on that. I gave you kind of an example of how our one-stop shop would would help bring deals together. The third component would be fostering fair and accessible business climate and creating a more robust financial sector. And that's really where our U.S. Agency for International Development would come in, and the support services that they have been providing for a number of years under or in support of African efforts to grow AGOA. What I mean by that is, you know, we've had a trade hub in West Africa that has really tried to provide technical assistance for developing export capabilities in West Africa. The good news is that trade hub is moving from Ghana to Abuja and Lagos, where it really should be, and will receive additional funding to provide both technical assistance specifically to companies, so that they can build in capabilities to export to the U.S., but also to work at the trade level association so that we create a sustainable environment where companies are working together to access the U.S. market. Now, I should mention that AGOA is a unilateral trade concession. What that means is it is an act of Congress which says African countries have access to the U.S. market duty-free for most products that they export. It doesn't commit us to helping in any way. It really signals to African countries that they should organize themselves, that they should put their own efforts in place to attracting investment so that they can access the U.S. market.
But I'm not sure, because the last time we spoke, we also talked about how, to what extent African countries are actually utilizing or taking advantage of it, and I'm not sure that the numbers are actually great.
So they're not great. And I will say, I don't know what I mentioned last time, but Nigeria, you know, I mean, its oil production industry has benefited from it, and basically very little other, very few other industries have benefited. The country that has probably been most strategic at taking advantage of AGOA is South Africa. And, you know, they had a bit of an auto industry going there, but strategically then, you know, they went to some auto manufacturers and said, hey, look, you have small investments here. We now have duty-free access to the United States market. Why don't you increase your investment? We'll give you some additional incentives to do so. We love to drive BMWs and Mercedes in the U.S., and you know, those production facilities in South Africa really exist for the South African market and the Southern African market, but primarily to export to the United States because they're getting duty-free access. The other way to look at AGOA strategically is to think supply chain, right? So another American company, I mentioned Corning before in the fiber optic space, but they actually make catalytic converters as well, which are necessary to clean the exhaust before, you know, it enters the air, and are, you know, regulated in the U.S. They've used AGOA in South Africa to manufacture catalytic converters in South Africa to export to auto production facilities in the United States. And they chose South Africa because of the zero duty rate.
Brent, hold that thought for us. We need to take a break at this point. We'll come back and pick up from where we left. If you're just joining us, Brent Omdahl, Commercial Counsel at the U.S. Department of Commerce, is with me, and we're discussing how the U.S. and Nigeria can forge a deeper partnership. Brent, thank you for your time so far.
You bet.
Let's pick up from where we left off, talking about the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, and how Nigeria, obviously there is room for improvement on the Nigerian side of things to take better advantage of of AGOA. But do you see any bright spots, anything that you see that gives you hope or encouragement?
Yes, I mean, one of the first things that a country needs to do to take full advantage of AGOA is have the infrastructure for exporting in place. So we're really encouraged, for instance, with the progress on the Lekki Free Trade Zone. And we're very happy that a U.S. company, Rendeavor, has made a $250 million investment there, built out a lot of infrastructure, and is now in the process of attracting manufacturing companies and other companies to the site to really use it as a way to satisfy the domestic market, but then start to look at export opportunities. We've also seen some movement of society organizations, private sector organizations, working on AGOA strategies, creating AGOA resource centers, figuring out the rules and regulations for exporting product back to the United States. And that's what really needs to take place at a foundational level for the industry then to kind of move up the value chain.
Okay, now while all of this is happening, obviously, we're all keeping our eyes on the growth of the economy,
Right.
which doesn't have a lot of, in terms of momentum, it could be better. We're still looking at growth of 2%. Now, for those American companies who were already investing in talks and, perhaps just eyeing the country, how big a concern is this for them? Because, we have all kinds of projections. Yes, there is optimism that we will see growth pick up in the coming years, in the coming years, but is this a factor that plays into, if I'm investing here, what is the growth rate? What is the kind of return I'm going to have on my investment compared to country Z, XYZ?
Yeah, well, if I were to answer your question, Esther, based on what I've observed from American investors, the fast-moving consumer space, the story is out on them. American companies understand that with 200 million people, they have to be here. And we've seen recent investments in that market. Kellogg's, Budweiser, and others. Coke has been here for a long time. But I would say the impediments, what keeps more companies away than just looking at the growth rate are some of the structural impediments to investing and doing business here. What I mean is the security situation, the power situation, and price controls. Price controls on power, fuel, and the currency. Those kind of throttle and are a disincentive. When a company is looking to invest, particularly from a foreign direct investment point of view, Nigeria is not competing with the U.S., they're competing with the rest of the world. Because a company will say, well, I could put my manufacturing site in Thailand, or I could put it in Nigeria. Where is it going to make most sense?
Okay. Well, that is true. Let's quickly talk about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. It's set to create the biggest free market in the world, and key trading partners outside of the continent are also looking to see how they can also perhaps be part of it and forge perhaps more strategic partnerships with already existing partners. But for the U.S., where does that leave you, and what is the strategy?
Yeah, so for sure the U.S. is in favor of any trade agreement that's going to create the free flow of goods and capital, that will make trading easier, that will incentivize the creation of infrastructure. And so we're fully supportive from the U.S. perspective of the new free trade area. Strategically, American companies that are invested here will also then begin to look at Africa as its own value chain. So, if you're manufacturing, let's take a car since we've been talking about it, certain components, some of that's not manufactured in Africa. And in fact, it's more difficult to move something from, say, Kenya to Nigeria than it is from the United States to Nigeria. And so with the free flow of goods, a company could say, hey, an American company might say, now I can make my brakes, my braking mechanisms in Kenya that I'm going to export to Nigeria because it's cheaper than sending it from the United States. So American companies will be very supportive of kind of opening up the whole trading and investment mechanism that goes behind the new African Continental Free Trade Zone. I will also say that our U.S. Trade Representative's Office has thought long and hard about this, and of course has for a long period of time promoted this on the continent as well. And I know that they're very inclined to take one of the more forward-leaning African countries and create a bilateral trade agreement with them, kind of based on the same thinking, the same principles as the Continental Free Trade Agreement, and then use that as a model to then blow it out to create a larger free trade agreement with the larger African continent based on the principles of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement.
But what do you see? If this actually does work out, if these African countries, Nigeria, including Nigeria just signed on, if they can actually make it work, remove those regional bottlenecks, even the non-tariff barriers that we're still struggling with on the continent, And what kind of shape do you see the continent taking from a trade perspective, and also especially how Africa trades with other partners outside of the continent?
Outside of the continent. Well, it will facilitate additional trade. It will create conduits for some of the creative thinking that already exists. Just to give you an example, I spoke with a Nigerian American businessman who is exporting a commodity from here to Europe. But what he has to go through to get some product from neighboring countries into Nigeria before sending it to Europe increased his costs by about 75%, right? So what that means is anything that is exported from the continent already has an additional price tag on, an additional tax that the consumer ends up paying. So the Continental Free Trade Agreement will break some of that down to the extent that it can reduce the price or the costs of moving products in and out between borders. It'll only make the cost basis, the competitive value of Nigerian and African products that much better.
Okay, I guess we'll wait and see. I mean, it's still obviously in its early days, and we're keeping our eyes on it and see how it all works out. Let's talk about your tenure as a commercial counsel at the Commerce Department. You're leaving soon, and let's talk about. Let's take a few steps back. What were those targets that you set for yourself in terms of what you wanted to do in terms of facilitating trade? I know that the U.S. affair was one of them in the later part of your tenure, but just overall, what are those targets that you set for yourself?
So I will say we're a global organization as the Department of Commerce, the Commercial Service. And even though we're a public institution, we have a bottom line. We actually measure and count the number of deals that take place when we put an American company together with a Nigerian or another company. And so we measure that. And I'll just tell you that when I came in, Nigeria was one of the highest performing offices, the highest on the continent and one of the highest in the world as far as the number of transactions that take place. So my team is very effective at bringing companies in and helping them find the right partner. Where we had a real gap was the transformative type of trade deals and investments that are really going to help Nigeria turn the corner. It took me about 4 months to realize that really is what my goal and our goal as a team ought to be. And so we set out to make some of that happen. There have been some disappointments. And again, we follow the private sector lead. We would have loved to have seen that GE rail deal take place. But unfortunately, we'll have to wait till another day on that. We have seen some great glimmers, though, that I hope my successor is able to pick up on. One of them is a company called Varian, who, together with the Lagos Teaching Hospital, found funding, local Nigerian funding through the Nigerian Investment Authority, Sovereign Investment Authority, and have put together Nigeria's first world-class cancer center here in Lagos. The plan is to duplicate that in several other states, but the great story behind that is that it's Nigerian financing bringing it together. And more of that needs to take place. The money actually is here. The question is, and Nigerian investors as well are as risk adverse as American or other international investors. So it's opening it up and making it more attractive to bring that money in. So that's one. Another one is one that John Deere did it's an MOU that they signed with the Ministry of Agriculture and NERSAL to really create investment opportunities for small cooperatives to provide mechanized farming services for smallholder farmers. And we've seen some of these now pop up because they got the financing right for these organizations to buy the tractors than to provide the service. That is a transformational kind of investment.
I was going to ask you, for those transactions that you'd have loved to see more of, the ones that the transformative, what would you say is that one key factor that perhaps always recurs in terms of posing as a bottleneck, a stumbling block, as it were?
Yeah, so you could, in a general sense, call it risk mitigation, but it's really reducing the impediments to trade. And it's a little different in every sector, right? So at its core, it's improving the power situation, right?
Structural.
It's improving transportation infrastructure. You know, how do you get the product to where it's going? And then it's improving, you know, putting risk mitigation strategies around the money to make it happen.
But overall, I mean, we have about 10 seconds left now.
Sorry.
How optimistic are you? I know you're handing over the baton to someone else. So can we expect trade to significantly improve going forward?
The easy answer is yes, and I'm coming back to Africa. I'm doing an excursion tour back in Asia, but I'm coming back to Africa because Africa is going to happen. Nigeria is going to happen in the next 10 to 15 years, and I definitely want to be a part of it.
Brent, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you.
I've been speaking to Brent Omdahl. He's a commercial counselor at the U.S. Department of Commerce. But that's it on Beyond Markets. Thank you so much for being a part of it. Remember, you can watch the show at 5 p.m. West African time daily and have access to all previous episodes of the show on our website. That's CNBCAfrica.com. You can also stay engaged with hashtag Beyond Markets. And of course, you can follow my Twitter handle too. It's at Esther O. Awoni. From myself and the team, it's bye for now.